The temperature outside William Cortland's cabin had fallen to 20 degrees below zero, and the blizzard showed no sign of breaking after 4 days of relentless wind and snow. Inside, he sat calmly near the center of his floor, where a rectangular pit lined with brick glowed faintly in the dim light, radiating warmth into every corner of the small room. The fire had died 3 hours earlier, but the bricks continued their work, storing and releasing heat with patient efficiency, while desperate voices called from outside his door, begging for shelter after their own fires had failed them. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of frontier ingenuity like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The spring of 1866 brought William Cortland and his wife Eliza to Cedar Flats, a small settlement of 19 families scattered across a high valley in the Rockies, Colorado Territory. They arrived with a wagon of supplies, basic carpentry tools, and the deed to 160 acres of land that required proving up under the Homestead Act. William was 32 years old, trained as a carpenter in Pennsylvania, and eager to build something permanent in the Western Territories. Eliza was 28, practical-minded, and unafraid of hard work. They planned to build a cabin before winter, establish crops the following spring, and create a life far from the crowded eastern cities they had left behind. The settlement's elder residents welcomed them with the cautious friendliness typical of frontier communities. Charles Whitmore, who served as the unofficial leader of Cedar Flats, helped William identify the best location for his cabin and warned him about the severity of winter at this elevation. The valley sat at 7,800 feet above sea level, high enough that storms arrived early and lingered late, and cold enough that proper shelter meant the difference between survival and tragedy. William listened carefully to these warnings, but the advice that truly changed his thinking came from an unexpected source. 3 days after their arrival, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson invited William and Eliza to her cabin for a meal. She lived alone in a small structure at the edge of the settlement, maintaining her late husband's homestead claim despite obvious difficulty. During the meal, she spoke quietly about the previous winter, about a storm that had trapped the settlement for 6 days in January of 1865, and about how her husband had frozen to death despite being inside their cabin with a fire burning in the fireplace. William assumed at first that they had run out of wood, but Mrs. Patterson corrected him. They had wood, they had a fire. But the heat escaped faster than the fire could produce it, rising through the chimney and disappearing into the frigid air outside, while the cabin's interior temperature dropped steadily despite their desperate efforts to keep the flames burning. Her husband had been 67 years old, weakened by a fall the previous autumn, and his body simply could not generate enough warmth to compensate for the cabin's failure to retain heat. He died on the 4th night of the storm, wrapped in every blanket they owned, lying inches from a fireplace that burned brightly but provided inadequate warmth. Mrs. Patterson showed William the fireplace in question. It was a standard frontier construction built into the corner of the cabin with river stone, featuring a simple firebox and a chimney that extended through the roof. It looked entirely adequate for its purpose, exactly like dozens of fireplaces William had seen in Pennsylvania and during his journey west. But Mrs. Patterson's husband was dead, and the fireplace had failed to save him. That night, lying beside Eliza in their temporary tent, William could not stop thinking about heat and how buildings held it or lost it. William began construction of his cabin in early June of 1866. Selecting a site on level ground with good drainage and proximity to the creek that ran through his property. He spent the first week cutting and hauling logs, selecting trees of consistent diameter, and stripping them of bark using a draw knife he had brought from Pennsylvania. The work was familiar and straightforward, following techniques he had learned during his apprenticeship years earlier. But when he began laying out the cabin's foundation, he did something that puzzled every neighbor who stopped by to observe his progress. Instead of starting with the corner posts or the first layer of logs, William marked out a rectangular area in the precise center of where his cabin floor would be. The rectangle measured 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, positioned so that it would sit equidistant from all 4 walls once the structure was complete. Then he began digging. He excavated the marked area to a depth of 18 inches, removing soil and rocks with methodical care, creating a pit with vertical walls and a level bottom. The excavated earth he piled nearby, setting it aside for later use. The pit itself he lined with flat stones gathered from the creek, creating a smooth base that would support weight without shifting or settling. Robert Finch, who owned the neighboring property to the west, stopped by on the third day of excavation and asked what William was building. William explained that it was the foundation for his heating system. Finch looked at the pit, looked at William, and asked why anyone would put a foundation in the middle of a floor instead of under the walls where it belonged. William said that the heating system required support and thermal mass, and that the center of the cabin was the optimal location for heat distribution. Finch shook his head and suggested that William was overcomplicating a simple task. A fireplace built into the corner with riverstone would take 2 days and would heat the cabin just fine. William thanked him for the advice and continued digging. Other neighbors offered similar observations over the following days. Daniel Cruz, whose cabin sat a quarter-mile to the north, asked if William was digging a root cellar and seemed confused when William explained it was for heating. Charles Whitmore stopped by with genuine concern, pointing out that William was now 10 days into his construction and had not yet raised a single wall. Winter came early at this elevation, sometimes arriving in late September, and a man who spent too much time on elaborate preparations might find himself without shelter when the first snows fell. William acknowledged the concern but did not change his approach. By mid-June, the pit was complete, and William turned his attention to an even more unusual task. He walked to the creek bed and began examining the exposed clay in the banks. He dug out several samples, testing their consistency, looking for clay that would hold its shape when formed and would fire into hard brick without cracking. When he found a suitable deposit, he spent 2 full days excavating clay and hauling it back to his cabin site in a wheelbarrow. He built a work table from scrap lumber and began forming bricks by hand. The bricks were simple rectangles, 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches thick. William formed them using a wooden mold he constructed specifically for this purpose, packing wet clay into the frame, smoothing the surface, then turning out the formed brick onto a flat board to dry in the sun. Each brick required approximately 3 minutes to form. William needed 250 bricks total for his heating system. He worked from dawn until dusk, forming bricks in batches of 50, laying them out to dry in rows, then starting the next batch. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, requiring constant trips to the creek for more clay and careful attention to consistency in each brick's composition. Eliza supported his efforts without complaint, though she understood the questions their neighbors were asking. A month into summer, and they still lived in a tent while William devoted his days to making bricks for a heating system no one else in Cedar Flats had ever seen or heard of. She helped when her other tasks allowed, forming bricks alongside him and organizing the drying racks. But privately she worried about Charles Whitmore's warning regarding winter's early arrival. They needed walls and a roof before snow came, and William seemed entirely focused on bricks. Robert Finch stopped by again in late June and stood watching William work for several minutes before speaking. He asked how many bricks William planned to make. William said 250. Finch asked what possible heating system required that many bricks. William explained that he was building a thermal mass structure that would absorb heat from fire and radiate it back over extended periods, and that the mass itself was the critical component. Finch said that sounded like a month's work for a fancy fire pit that probably would not work any better than a regular fireplace. William continued forming bricks and said nothing in response. The mockery spread through the small settlement over the following weeks. Neighbors began referring to the project as Cortland's brick obsession or the buried stove that no one understood. Some genuinely believed William was wasting precious construction time on an untested idea. Others simply found humor in watching an educated Pennsylvania carpenter spend weeks making bricks by hand when perfectly good riverstone lay everywhere for free. Charles Whitmore stopped by twice more, each time expressing concern about the calendar and the approach of autumn. William acknowledged the concern each time but did not alter his schedule. By mid-July, all 250 bricks were formed and drying. William built a temporary kiln using stones and clay, stacking the dried bricks inside in a pattern that allowed heat and smoke to circulate. He fired the kiln using hardwood, maintaining temperature for 2 full days while the clay transformed into hard ceramic. When the kiln cooled and he extracted the finished bricks, he had lost 17 to cracking or breakage. He formed 17 more bricks to replace them, dried them for a week, and fired them in a second smaller kiln. By the end of July, he had 250 usable bricks stacked near his excavated pit, ready for construction of the heating system that would define his cabin's character. William began laying bricks in early August of 1866, working with the careful precision of someone who understood that structural integrity depended on proper foundation and alignment. He started with the floor of the pit, setting bricks flat across the stone base he had prepared weeks earlier. Each brick was positioned with minimal gaps, creating a continuous ceramic surface that would serve as the fire bed. He used a mixture of clay and sand as mortar between bricks, pressing it into the joints and smoothing the excess. The floor required 60 bricks, laid in a tight pattern that covered the entire 3-foot by 5-foot rectangle. When finished, the pit had a level, heat-resistant base that would support years of fires without degradation. The walls came next. William built them up from the pit floor using the same careful technique, stacking bricks in running bond pattern where each brick overlapped the joints of the bricks below. The walls rose vertically along all 4 sides of the pit, creating a rectangular enclosure that matched the pit's dimensions. He built the walls to a height that would bring them 8 inches above the cabin's floor level once he installed the floorboards around the structure. This rim would contain the fire and prevent embers from escaping onto the wooden floor. The walls required 140 bricks, and William spent 5 days completing them, checking alignment constantly and ensuring each course was level before proceeding to the next. When the brickwork was complete, William stepped back and surveyed what he had created. The structure occupied 12 square feet of his cabin's interior, a significant footprint that would be immediately obvious to anyone who entered. The brick walls rose from below floor level, creating a sunken hearth that sat in the center of where his cabin would stand. To anyone familiar with traditional frontier construction, it looked strange and impractical. Fireplaces belonged in corners, built against walls, with chimneys extending upward through the roof. This sat in the middle of open space, low to the ground, with no chimney visible. It looked like an indoor campfire pit, surrounded by unnecessary brickwork. Robert Finch arrived on the day William finished and brought 2 other neighbors with him. They stood around the structure, examining it from different angles. Finch asked where the chimney would go. William pointed upward and said he would install a metal stovepipe that would rise through the roof, positioned to create draft without dominating the structure. The pipe would be narrow, just wide enough to vent smoke efficiently. One of the other neighbors asked why William had buried the hearth instead of building it up like a normal fireplace. William explained that heat rises and that a floor-level fire surrounded by thermal mass would warm the cabin more efficiently than an elevated firebox. The neighbor said it looked like a lot of work for questionable benefit. Finch said it looked like Cortland's Folly, and the name stuck. By mid-August, William finally began raising the cabin walls around his completed hearth, working with renewed speed now that his heating system was in place and functional. The cabin walls rose quickly once William committed to their construction. He worked long days through late August and into September, fitting logs with the same careful attention he had applied to his brickwork. By early October, the structure was complete with a sturdy roof, proper door and window, and floorboards laid around the perimeter of his buried hearth. The floor level now sat flush with the brick rim, creating a seamless transition between wood and masonry. William installed a narrow stovepipe through the roof directly above the hearth, ensuring adequate draft for smoke ventilation. The first fire he lit in his completed cabin burned cleanly, filling the space with warmth that radiated outward from the brick structure in steady waves. Daniel Cruz stopped by one afternoon in mid-October, curious about how the system actually functioned now that the cabin was habitable. William invited him inside and explained his thinking while a modest fire burned in the hearth. He started with the fundamental problem that traditional fireplaces created heat that rose immediately upward through the chimney, escaping the living space before it could warm the structure adequately. The fireplace itself remained cold except for the firebox, offering no heat, storage, or retention. When the fire died or weakened, the cabin cooled rapidly because no thermal mass existed to hold and release warmth over time. The buried hearth solved this problem through basic physics applied with deliberate engineering. The 250 bricks surrounding and beneath the fire absorbed heat continuously while flames burned. Clay brick was an excellent thermal mass material, capable of storing significant heat energy and releasing it slowly over hours. When William let his fire die down in the evening, the bricks continued radiating warmth throughout the night, maintaining comfortable temperatures inside the cabin long after visible flames disappeared. The floor-level placement meant heat radiated upward and outward in all directions rather than concentrating near the ceiling, where it provided minimal benefit to the occupants below. Daniel asked about fuel consumption. William explained that he maintained 2 fires daily, one in early morning and one in early evening, each burning for approximately 2 hours. Between fires, the thermal mass carried the cabin's temperature with minimal drop. His neighbors with traditional fireplaces needed to maintain nearly constant fires to achieve similar warmth, consuming 3 to 4 times as much wood over the course of a day. Daniel admitted the efficiency was impressive, but said that rebuilding his existing cabin to incorporate a buried hearth would require dismantling everything he had already constructed. The investment seemed too large for uncertain benefit. William understood the hesitation. His system required commitment during initial construction, not something easily added afterward. But he believed the long-term advantages justified the effort, particularly in a climate where winter storms could trap families inside for days with limited fuel access. Daniel thanked him for the explanation and left unconvinced but thoughtful. Over the following weeks, other neighbors visited and received similar demonstrations. Most acknowledged that the system worked, but questioned whether it worked well enough to justify the unusual construction methods and substantial material investment required. The first serious cold arrived in mid-November of 1866, dropping temperatures into the single digits overnight and coating the valley with 6 inches of fresh snow. William woke before dawn and built a small fire in his hearth, using kindling and split logs arranged in a compact stack that would burn efficiently for 90 minutes. The bricks, still holding residual warmth from the previous evening's fire, came up to temperature quickly. Within 30 minutes, the cabin interior reached a comfortable 65 degrees. William let the fire burn down naturally, and by the time he finished his breakfast and morning tasks, only glowing coals remained in the hearth. The bricks continued their work, radiating stored heat throughout the morning. He went outside mid-morning to split firewood and noticed smoke pouring steadily from Robert Finch's chimney next door. The smoke continued throughout the day, indicating a fire that burned constantly without pause. That evening, William built his second fire of the day, another modest arrangement that burned for 2 hours before dying back to coals. He banked the coals with ash before bed, and the cabin maintained temperature above 50 degrees through the night, despite outdoor conditions dropping to 0. 2 fires, perhaps 20 pounds of wood total, and his cabin remained comfortably warm for 24 hours. 3 days into the cold snap, Robert Finch stopped by and accepted William's invitation to come inside. The contrast was immediate. William's cabin felt warm enough that he wore only a light wool shirt. Finch kept his heavy coat on and stood near the hearth, where coals from the morning fire still glowed faintly beneath a layer of ash. Finch remarked that the cabin held heat better than he expected. William asked about Finch's own heating situation. Finch admitted he was burning wood constantly, feeding his fireplace every 2 to 3 hours to maintain adequate warmth. His wife complained about the smoke and the constant need for fuel, and his woodpile was diminishing faster than he had anticipated for early winter. Finch examined the brick structure more carefully, running his hand along the rim and feeling the warmth radiating from masonry that had not seen active flame in 4 hours. He asked specific questions about construction technique and material costs. William answered honestly, explaining the time investment and the quantity of bricks required. Finch admitted the system worked well for this level of cold, but said the real test would come with deep winter storms when temperatures stayed below zero for days, and wind made outdoor wood gathering dangerous or impossible. Anyone could heat a cabin in moderate cold. The question was whether buried hearth construction provided meaningful advantage during genuine crisis conditions. William agreed that winter's worst weather would provide the definitive test. He noted, however, that his fuel consumption was running at roughly 40% of what his neighbors reported using. If that ratio held during severe cold, his woodpile would last significantly longer during extended storms when resupply became impossible. Finch acknowledged the logic but remained skeptical about whether efficiency margins would matter during true emergencies. The storm system that would become known throughout the territory as the Blizzard of '67 began forming over the mountains west of Cedar Flats in mid-January of 1867. Weather signs appeared 3 days before the first snow fell. The temperature dropped. Steadily, the sky took on a peculiar yellow-gray color, and animals behaved with obvious agitation. Charles Whitmore went from cabin to cabin, advising families to secure extra firewood and check their food supplies. William spent 2 days splitting and stacking wood close to his door, bringing enough inside to last a week if outdoor access became impossible. Eliza prepared meals that could be stretched across multiple days and checked their inventory of candles, lamp oil, and basic medical supplies. The snow began falling on the morning of January 16th. It started as light flurries that quickly intensified into heavy, continuous precipitation. By afternoon, visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. The temperature fell to 10 degrees below zero, and wind began gusting hard enough to create drifts against the cabin walls. William built his morning fire as usual and watched through the window as the storm strengthened. He built his evening fire at the regular time, let it burn for 2 hours, then banked the coals carefully. The cabin temperature held steady at 62 degrees while wind howled outside and snow accumulated at a rate of 2 inches per hour. The second day brought worse conditions. Wind speeds increased, creating whiteout conditions that made seeing more than 10 feet impossible. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero. Snow drifts reached 4 feet in some areas, burying fences and low structures. William maintained his normal fire schedule, 2 burns per day, each lasting approximately 2 hours. Between fires, the brick hearth radiated stored warmth with quiet consistency. He spent the day inside with Eliza, reading, doing small maintenance tasks, and monitoring their supplies. The buried hearth glowed periodically as bricks released their stored thermal energy, keeping the cabin comfortable without requiring constant attention or fuel consumption. Day 3 continued the pattern. Unrelenting snow, brutal wind, temperatures hovering around 20 below zero. The storm showed no signs of weakening. William could no longer see his woodpile through the window. Drifts had buried it completely. He had enough wood inside to last several more days, but he began calculating consumption rates and considering rationing strategies if the storm extended beyond a week. His 2 fires per day routine continued working effectively. The thermal mass system performed exactly as he had designed it to, storing heat during burn periods and releasing it gradually during the long hours between fires. By the 4th day, the true severity of the situation became apparent. This was not a typical winter storm that would blow through in 48 hours. This was an extended weather system that had settled over the valley and seemed content to remain indefinitely. William heard nothing from his neighbors. No one moved outside in these conditions. Cabins became isolated islands, separated by impassable barriers of wind and snow and cold that could kill an exposed person in minutes. The pounding on William's door came near midnight on the 4th night of the blizzard. He woke instantly, disoriented by the sound cutting through the wind's constant roar. Eliza stirred beside him as he rose and moved to the door, calling out to identify who stood outside in conditions that should have made travel impossible. Robert Finch's voice answered, strained and desperate, saying his fire had gone out and his family was freezing. William unbarred the door immediately and pulled it open against the wind pressure. Finch stumbled inside, followed by his wife and 2 young children, all of them covered in snow and shaking violently from cold despite their heavy clothing. William closed the door and guided them toward the hearth, where coals from the evening fire still glowed beneath ash. The brick rim radiated warmth that was immediately apparent when standing close. Finch's wife and children pressed against the brick wall, seeking heat that their own cabin no longer provided. Finch explained through chattering teeth that they had burned through their accessible firewood by mid-afternoon. Their fireplace consumed fuel at an unsustainable rate, and the storm had buried their outdoor woodpile under drifts they could not navigate safely. They had tried to maintain the fire using furniture and scraps, but the wind had created downdrafts that filled their cabin with smoke. The fire had died completely around 10 that evening, and the temperature inside had dropped so rapidly that Finch realized his children would not survive the night. He had made the decision to attempt the 100-yard journey to William's cabin, a distance that in whiteout conditions with deep snow had taken nearly 30 minutes to cross. More pounding came 20 minutes later. Daniel Cruz arrived with his eldest son, both of them frostbitten and exhausted. Their situation mirrored Finch's experience. Fire went out, cabin cooling rapidly, no choice but to seek help. William welcomed them inside and pointed to the hearth. The structure that neighbors had mocked 6 months earlier now served as the only reliable heat source in Cedar Flats. William added wood to the coals and built up a modest fire, not large or dramatic, just sufficient to bring the bricks back to full temperature. Within 40 minutes, the cabin interior reached 68 degrees, with 8 people occupying a space designed for 2. The refugees stood or sat on the floor near the hearth, absorbing warmth that radiated from brick walls that had not seen active flame when they first arrived. Finch's children fell asleep pressed against the warm masonry. Daniel Cruz examined the construction closely, running his hands over the brickwork and asking technical questions about mortar composition and thermal retention rates. William answered quietly, while Eliza prepared hot tea for everyone using water heated over the low fire. The storm continued outside, but inside William's cabin, the buried hearth maintained temperature with efficiency that had transformed from theoretical advantage to literal life preservation. Nobody spoke about the mockery from months earlier. Morning arrived on the 5th day with subtle signs that the storm was weakening. The wind had diminished, from howling fury to steady gusts, and visibility through the cabin windows improved to perhaps 30 yards. The snow continued falling, but with less intensity. William woke to find his cabin crowded with sleeping refugees arranged around the perimeter of the buried hearth. The fire had died completely during the night, reduced to cold ash, yet the cabin temperature remained at 54 degrees. The brick structure had carried the warmth through 8 hours of darkness without any active flame, a demonstration of thermal retention that would have seemed impossible to anyone familiar only with traditional fireplace heating. He built a small morning fire using kindling and split logs from his indoor supply. The bricks came up to temperature within 30 minutes, and the cabin warmed to 65 degrees shortly after. The refugees woke gradually, stiff from sleeping on the floor, but vastly improved from their condition upon arrival. Finch's children appeared healthy, with no signs of serious cold exposure. Everyone gathered near the hearth as William prepared a simple breakfast using supplies. Eliza rationed carefully to feed 8 people instead of 2. Robert Finch spent much of the morning studying the hearth construction with intense focus. He asked William to explain every aspect of the design, from the depth of the foundation pit to the specific dimensions of the brick walls to the reasoning behind the floor-level placement. William answered each question in detail, describing the principles of thermal mass and heat distribution that govern the system's effectiveness. Finch asked about construction time. William said the brickmaking and hearth building had consumed approximately 6 weeks total. Finch said that 6 weeks invested during summer was preferable to dying of cold exposure during winter. His wife nodded in agreement, still standing close to the warm brick rim despite the cabin's comfortable ambient temperature. Charles Whitmore arrived mid-morning with 2 other families, having made the difficult journey from his cabin when the weather briefly cleared. His own fire had remained functional, but barely, and he had heard from others that William's cabin was sheltering refugees. He entered and immediately understood what he was seeing. The buried hearth radiated warmth into a space that held 11 people comfortably, heated by a fire that William described as modest by any measure. Whitmore examined the brickwork, asked about fuel consumption rates, and said without hesitation that this was the most important structure in Cedar Flats. He told William that every family rebuilding after the storm would incorporate this design, and that new homesteaders would be advised to build buried hearths before anything else. The storm broke completely by evening of the 6th day. Families returned to their cabins to assess damage and salvage what remained. 3 structures had sustained serious damage from desperate attempts to maintain heat using excessive fires or inappropriate fuel. William's cabin stood unchanged, his woodpile still 60% intact despite hosting refugees for 2 days. The buried hearth had proven its worth under conditions that validated engineering over tradition. Spring of 1867 arrived late in the High Valley, with snow lingering into April and temperatures remaining unpredictable through May. The settlement spent those months rebuilding and adapting, incorporating hard lessons learned during the blizzard that had nearly killed multiple families. Robert Finch began construction on a buried hearth in March, dismantling the damaged corner of his cabin where his traditional fireplace had stood and excavating a pit in the center of his living space. He followed William's techniques exactly, making bricks from creek clay and building the structure with careful attention to thermal mass principles. The work took 3 weeks, and when finished, Finch admitted openly that he had been a fool to mock engineering he did not understand. Daniel Cruz added a buried hearth to his existing cabin through even more extensive renovation, cutting through his floor and removing structural elements to accommodate the new heating system. The project consumed a month of work, but Cruz said repeatedly that the investment was worthwhile after watching William's system save lives during the storm. By summer, 5 families had incorporated buried hearths into new or rebuilt cabins. Charles Whitmore began requiring the design for all new homesteaders, explaining that Cedar Flats could not afford to lose residents to preventable cold exposure during severe weather. What he called Cortland's Law became unofficial policy, and the settlement's character changed as buried hearths became standard rather than exceptional. The technique spread beyond Cedar Flats through normal frontier communication channels. Travelers stopping at the settlement saw the unusual heating systems and asked questions. Families relocating to other valleys carried the knowledge with them and built buried hearths in their new locations. By 1868, neighboring settlements reported a dozen buried hearth cabins. By 1870, the design had reached communities across the Colorado High Country and into Wyoming Territory. The spread was organic and undirected, driven simply by the fact that the system worked demonstrably better than traditional alternatives in environments where winter survival depended on heating efficiency. William and Eliza lived quietly through these years, never seeking recognition for the innovation that had changed frontier construction practices across the region. William continued farming his homestead claim, added a barn and outbuildings, and helped neighbors with construction projects when asked. The buried hearth in his cabin performed reliably through 15 more winters before William and Eliza eventually moved to Denver in 1882, when age made frontier life impractical. The cabin passed to new owners who maintained it for decades, and the hearth continued functioning as designed, requiring only occasional repointing of mortar between bricks. Mrs. Patterson, the widow whose story had inspired William's original obsession with heating systems, survived 3 more harsh winters in her own cabin before passing peacefully in her sleep in 1870. Before her death, Daniel Cruz had rebuilt her fireplace as a buried hearth at no cost, ensuring her final years included the warmth her husband had died without. The engineering that had seemed like folly proved to be fortune favoring those who prepared, and the buried hearths of Cedar Flats stood as permanent testament to the principle that knowledge applied with care could overcome tradition's dangerous limitations.